Welcome to Presence, a global conversation for a new earth, with hosts Doug King and Cody Deese.
Welcome back, everybody, to the Presence Podcast. I am in the driver's seat, your host, Cody, and obviously the one and only Doug King is here in the house recording.
And I am ready to go, man. This is fun.
Doug,
this is good.
We start a new podcast series. Before we get into it,
Yep.
Let me mention one thing again to our listeners. Info@presence.tv. Please send us your questions. We're going to do a future episode, hopefully, on all the questions that come in. So don't be alarmed if you don't get an immediate response. We're taking and collecting, and hopefully we'll address those questions on this podcast in a future episode. Okay? Now, that said, we started a new conversation last week called PostChristian. This is part 2. Doug leaves Christianity. It's so great that I'm having a good time.
Yeah, I can tell you are, and you know it's a relevant subject because there are a lot of people that are leaving Christianity, but not in the same way and not for the same reasons.
And that's what I want to get into because that's what I'm really interested in.
Of course, sure.
Okay, last week I asked a question. Do you currently identify as a Christian? You said no.
Mm-hmm.
Then I asked a follow-up question. Have you ever identified as a Christian? To which you said yes. We spent the entire last podcast walking through your own personal story. At 10 years old, you walked down an aisle, were baptized, and Doug, you became a Christian in that moment.
Yes, I did.
Okay. All was well.
Mm-hmm.
At what point, because if you no longer identify as a Christian, at some point you left Christianity. So I want to talk about that. Now, I want to start with this question. Your leaving Christianity, was it like your experience of coming into Christianity where it happened in one moment? Was there a moment where you walked down the aisle of like a pagan church and was like, I'm done, I deconvert? Was it a single moment or was it a process? Or tell us a little bit about the start of what was happening and at what age and where were you in the world when you began to even think, wait a minute, something isn't right, and or you were being pulled out? Can you give us some language about what time in that life, like where you were at, what season?
Yeah, because my life was an evolutionary process, and some people would say devolving process rather. But it's like all consciousness and positions that we hold in life. We all look back over our lives and we see where we've changed in different ways. Mine had to do with actually a very significant movement all the way into the realm I see now as a post-religious realm. And it really started, Cody, back when I went to college. Again, as I said in the first podcast, I was a year younger than most folks. So when I went to college my freshman year, I was 17.
Where'd you go to school at?
I went to Harding College in Searcy, Arkansas, and it was a Church of Christ supported college.
And you were, how did you end up in Arkansas? Because you guys were in Ohio.
Okay, so one of my best friends growing up, Scott, his dad was an elder in our church, and his dad was from Arkansas and was very familiar with Harding. The other thing is that, you know, in our denomination, you have these circuit speakers, right? Mm-hmm. And so there are these heroes of the faith.
We call those evangelists.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, sure. And so these guys, though, were professors at the college. So the other Church of Christ colleges were David Lipscomb in Nashville.
Lipscomb. Yeah.
Abilene Christian out in Abilene, Texas, ACU, where, by the way, Don Beck went to school. A lot of people don't know that.
And for those that don't know, Don is the writer of
Spiral Dynamics. Yeah. And so he grew up in the Church of Christ. So I went to a Church of Christ college. I was 17 years of age. Freshman year went great.
Is it like a full 4-year college?
4-year.
And so you went in studying what?
I had a double major, theology and biblical languages. So I took theological courses and got my degree in a double major in that, and then I took Greek and Hebrew, and that was my other major.
Wow.
So, yeah, I did both.
That's pretty intense.
Yeah. I loved science when I was a kid in high school, and I was the lab assistant in chemistry and all this good stuff. So when I first went to college, I had a minor in chemistry. I was just purely theology major, chemistry minor, began to realize that I was not going to be Albert Einstein or a chemist. And so I changed to a double major, and I've always been fascinated with languages. So I did that. Freshman year was cool. Got to know people. You know the deal, Cody. You go there and you join a club, and you do all the sports, and life was amazing because it was all Church of Christ people. When you grow up in northeastern Ohio, it's very heavily Catholic and other types of European type Protestant religions even. So there were not a lot of people in Ohio that were of the Church of Christ denomination that we were in. And so when I went to Harding, it was amazing. Everybody was the Church of Christ, primarily. Mm-hmm. But the deconstruction for me, the movement began not because I was walking away from Christianity at all, but because my Christian understanding was shaken with regard to things that Dad was writing in the field of eschatology. The Church of Christ had a very, very strong belief in a future coming of Jesus, where you would literally see Jesus come down out of the sky in the clouds. You would hear the trumpet. The planet Earth would burn up, and you would go before God on Judgment Day. Now, you did have to go judgment.
To our listeners that don't, most of them do, but eschatology being the study of end times.
Ah, yes.
Yes.
Yeah, good point.
No, but proceed.
And then you'd go to the Judgment Day and so on and so forth. And so when Dad wrote a different appropriation of eschatology to the historical content of the passing of the ages, which we've gone through ad infinitum in all these podcasts, and which are all over our website and in books we've written. That change in what I would call a creedal or dogmatic view that would happen in any fundamentalist group always brings about cries of heresy, apostate, because again, when you're in that, as spiral dynamics would call it, blue meme or traditional or fundamentalist viewpoint, then the truth and defending the truth was really critical. And I had now moved into a place that I never in my life dreamed I would move into, and that was a place where people were actually saying that the things that my dad was writing were actually heresy. And so the first step in the movement of consciousness that I was experiencing had to do with the fact that my family, via my dad's writings, were actually moving into modernity because we were willing to question the existing boundaries, and we were really questioning what the interpretations were that had existed in the first place.
But you didn't have that language then.
Did not have that language at all. All I knew was that I thought, I was excited. I thought, oh, wow, my dad has discovered some amazing things here. I can't wait to tell all these professors.
And he was beginning to get labeled heretic,
big time,
outsider, stuff like that. And so you were experiencing this as you're, 18, 19?
Yes, I was. Okay. I was 19 the spring of 71 when the book came out.
So this is interesting. So you're saying that, as you look back and reflect now, that was actually the beginning of you exiting Christianity?
Well, yeah,
but you wouldn't have called it that at the moment.
No, not at the moment. But I think for most of our listeners, if you as a listener have gone through stages where you were going to a church and you started questioning what they believed, and you went to another church because it was more accommodating to the larger views that you had, then you have already, or are in the process of already, deconstructing where you used to be. You see, to get to where I am, I had to go through a deconstruction process. You don't just wake up one day and say, yeah, yesterday I was a Christian, but you know what? Today I'm not. I don't go by that moniker or label anymore. That is a process. And the same with our listeners, right, Cody? And you've done the same thing. We all have done this. Even people who may not agree with our particular viewpoint. I'm going to say that 90% plus of people that would listen to our podcast have already gone through a lot of deconstruction in their own lives, even if they still call themselves a Christian, even if they are still going to a church. They're probably seen by a lot of people as progressive, emergent, postmodern, more liberal than others, et cetera, et cetera. That's usually the language that starts the change. When you're hearing that language or when you're experiencing that kind of conversation and you're the one that's moved on, then you're well on your way on a trajectory that has led me to the place of post-Christian. And in my belief, of course, I believe that's where the world is actually headed.
That makes sense. And the thing is, too, it's not that they're who they've always been. It's you that's changed. And I think that's really imperative to notice. Now, back to your story, you began to happen to your dad, and you began to experience that. What was that like? Did that drive you to dig deeper? Did it drive you to be like, to hell with Christianity? Were you, or what was happening in you while these shots were taken at your father and his work?
Yeah, that's interesting you bring that up, because I never had a thought in my mind at that time and for years to come that I would be anything other than a Christian trying to correctly interpret the story. So I never had any thoughts that I was headed toward anything called post-Christian. And I was never, ever at a place where I said, well, the heck with Christianity, I'm out of here. My desire is kind of like a Luther thing, right? Luther started questioning, and then that led to protests and whatever. So I'm questioning these old interpretations of eschatology as this catastrophic event and all the stuff that goes with that, and bodies coming up out of the ground for us.
And you're finding it's very exclusive, and there's not a lot of margin to work with there.
None.
Yeah.
Really. But it really inspired within me, first of all, to question. And I even questioned that view, because for me, Cody, it would have been a lot easier for me to say, well, this obviously can't be true because everybody in my denomination says it can't be true. And so this is really crazy. And
towed the party line.
I could have given it up real easy and just towed the party line. And who couldn't? If you've ever been, again, as a listener, in a controversial discussion within a particular group, there's always this thing of, hey, can't we all just get along? There are always going to be a lot of people in your group that say, hey, can't we just get along? And what they mean when they say, can't we all just get along? What they actually mean is, can't you drop your beliefs and just go along with mine?
I feel it. So this is happening to you at college. Okay.
Yeah.
Fast forward a little bit. You finished college?
Oh, yeah. I got my degree and actually went on to the Harding Graduate School in Memphis, Tennessee. I actually went over there and attempted to get my master's. At
any point in this process, did it cross your mind to consider other denominations, that maybe this was just a denominational thing, that you're like, they're just not accepting of my father, but if we went to a more liberal, Protestant type denomination, maybe there'd be more accepting, maybe there'd be a little more wiggle room. Was that ever anything that popped in your head?
It wasn't. What's interesting is that because I held a very traditional view of the truth, I believe that the Church of Christ had the truth with regard to conversion and all these things, but they just needed to get their eschatology right. So I saw myself as a reformer.
I get it. Okay.
I need to reform those parts of my denomination that have missed the boat on this particular subject. So I'm not trying to leave. It's like, I guess, Luther in the beginning, he said he did not like the term Lutheran. He did not want followers to call themselves Lutherans. He was merely trying to reform the church.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really what I was trying to do for decades in the 70s and 80s, in the first iteration of where I was with my deconstruction.
Okay, so this was you had no idea that you would have ever even thought about like walking away to another denomination, because in your opinion, you all had the market on the truth as it pertains to the gospel and Jesus and heaven and all that stuff.
Yes.
But this doctrine of eschatology, you believe they had wrong.
Correct.
Okay.
And I thought if they could just get that right, then we've got it.
Okay. So fast forward.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us more about this progression. So obviously that was the start of you beginning to question some things.
Yes.
Doesn't sound like you were questioning a lot. It sounds like you were questioning just the doctrine of eschatology per se. But you weren't questioning to the point where you're like, I need to get the hell out of here. Or I need to find another denomination. So you're still very much so in there. At what point was there another marker in your life where you're like, and here's another big event that I began to question more, and all of a sudden it moves out of just eschatology and becomes a little bit broader?
That event would have been with the writing. Again, I would tie to my dad's books. I studied with my dad, through life up until now. I still have phone calls with him. Well, Dad released his book, The Cross and the Parousia, in 1987. And in 1989, we decided to start Presence and have conferences. So we had conferences starting in 1989 of other people who would come in who were holding this same view, and they came from all over the country. And they would come in, and the conversation, Cody, then started turning to, well, if we're in the new heaven and earth now, what does that mean? What does that mean? What does it mean to be in the new heaven and earth? Do you still have to get baptized into it? Are you already in it? What about sin and death? If sin and death are defeated, well, how do I then die to that if it's already defeated? So all of a sudden, conversations started about what is the nature of the space that we're saying, New Jerusalem, new heaven and earth. If it's already come, what difference does it make?
Okay. Well, how old are you at this point?
Well, then you're talking about that conversation really picked up 89 and 90. So let's say in 92, I would have been 40. Okay.
So from college 20 to 40, that whole process, was everything just kind of smooth sailing? You were a Christian, you go to church?
No. That was, I had to keep my eschatological views under wrap and study with people on the side. I had to keep my views in the closet.
Made sense.
Could not come out, so
on
to
that
speak.
particular doctrine.
On that doctrine. And as long as I did that, then I went to the Church of Christ wherever I lived, and I lived different places and under different circumstances.
Because you were doing other business then at that point, right?
At that point, because I knew, I was told, see, in graduate school, they eliminated my scholarship because the dean of the school said, with my eschatological views, the words he literally used were, you will not be of any use. Those are great things to hear when you're in grad school and you've spent your whole life on degrees and learning Greek and Hebrew and everything, for somebody to say, oh, and by the way, you won't be of any use. But when I realized that, I dropped out of graduate school and literally went to an employment company, Cody, in the 70s. And I had no business courses. I had no business background. And the guy that was doing the employment agency said, man, you're such a good communicator. I think you'd be great in sales. By whatever you want to call it, I ended up in the field of telecommunications, and the rest was history. I did really well in business, going through the sales route and eventually owning my own company.
And when you got into the business world and that experience happened to you, which is very traumatic, we should add, like when someone in that high of an authority in your life tells you you're not going to be of any use, first of all, that man needs to be fired.
Cody, I literally was in 7-Eleven trying to get a job as a manager. And the guy's looking at my resume, and he looks up at me and he says, what the blankety blank does a guy with a degree in Bible languages want to manage a 7-Eleven? How do you answer that?
Okay.
I was in chaos.
Because this is a humbling moment in your life.
Oh my gosh, it was traumatic.
At this point, were you not like, to hell with Christianity, I'm out of here?
No, I never, ever.
It just, you were never in a space to even cross your mind.
No,
wow.
No, I was in survival mode.
Yeah.
So the only thing I was thinking was, how do I now get a job and pay the rent? That's what I was thinking.
And so even after this experience with this dean at a Christian school, you still faithfully, even in this process, went to church and subscribed to what you had subscribed to since you were 10 years old, with the exception of the shifts and move towards the end times type theology. That's interesting.
That's it. I stuck with it.
And so all that led to the time that you mentioned earlier where your dad begins this conference at Presence. That sounds like this gathering was kind of a bunch of folks nerding out on end time stuff.
It was. It was. Well, right now, and again,
and that was a big deal in that year too.
That movement is called the Preterist movement, which some people may not even know that name. And Preterism was a starting point for me. I didn't stay there. I didn't get stuck there, where all I did was, to this day, year after year, argue with people about whether or not the second coming is future or past.
Man, I didn't realize, Doug, that's and for those of you listeners that aren't familiar with it, I was not familiar with it until I started learning a little bit about it. But it's still a community. They're like interesting people that are like there's a whole group of them.
That's a whole nother conversation in and of itself, because the Preterist movement is one that does believe you're in the new heaven and earth, but they've still got a future judgment day and saved, lost, and a lot of things. That's a whole nother conversation. But the point is that when we started in this movement up through the 90s, all those people were coming, and they were closet people in their own church, and they were Church of Christ people initially. Now, eventually, we had people from other denominations come and attend this conference, and here's the deal. It was like the Jerusalem conference, right? All of a sudden, all of us Church of Christ people were wondering, do we just accept these people from other denominations who believe the same thing about the second coming we do? Do we just let them in here and let them speak too? Because they're not a member of the Church of Christ.
Yeah. I get that. So this is unraveling even more for you at this point. So now that the onion's being peeled and it's no longer just about eschatology, now you're starting to think, hold on a minute. Now we've got people from the outside that aren't Church of Christ.
Right.
Do we allow them in? So you're now moving into conversations of ethnocentricity, world centricity.
Yes.
Is at this point you're starting to begin to question things like, oh, okay, I got to rethink this.
Really, identity is what you begin to question, and that is the thing about postmodernity is that's where the ecumenical movement shows up, which was anathema when I was in college. In other words, to me, ecumenicalism was heresy. There was one true church, and we were it. And there was the truth, and then there was everything else. And so when you begin having discussions and you find out that these people, by the way, one of the first that came was a guy who was a teacher, a professor, and he was a Baptist. And he came up to Warren because he was so enthralled with this particular view, as opposed to the premillennial view that he had been familiar with. So as you are going through this, you are entering into a more postmodern view of identity, that maybe identity is bigger than what I thought growing up. Maybe there are more people that are going to be saved that are actually in all these different denominations. So you can see this inclusion trajectory is already growing in my mind.
Was there, so this starts unraveling a whole series of questions for you. At what point, and I know we're probably fast forwarding here quite a bit, was there a night you went to bed and then you were like, yeah, it's confirmed? Was there a day that you went public going, I am no longer a Christian?
So I was already moving down that track, had already had many conversations in our seminars and with Dad about this movement into a universal God identity. And I began to present ideas in a Sunday school class I was in at a Church of Christ that were moving toward these kinds of thinking without explicitly, obviously, coming out and saying it.
And this was at Church of Christ as well?
It was a Church of Christ.
So you were a Sunday school teacher and you started presenting these ideas.
Yes. And the class I was in started with like 10 or 12 people and it grew to 55.
Oh, you had numeric growth. Congratulations.
And that's normally good, except when you're teaching something that's a problem. And then all of a sudden, elders began to sit in on my Sunday school class because they realized I was teaching something dangerous.
Yeah, the gatekeepers.
So what happened, Cody, was that it finally hit the fan to the extent that they wanted Danae, my wife, and I, and our family out. They wanted us out of the Church of Christ, of that Church of Christ. So they called a meeting in which all the elders were together, and they were going to let me know that we could no longer be part of that denomination, and they wanted us out. The day that meeting was to take place was 9/11, September 1st, 2001.
Oh, wow.
That was the day that meeting was to take place.
That's interesting. So that meeting was supposed to take place the day the Twin Towers went down.
And it was because of my views about the day the temple went down. So in my life, I saw empire going down as one of the key things about human identity and identifying with buildings and identifying with empires and identifying with religions. And when I walked out the door, we rescheduled the meeting for the next week. I never went back because number one,
wow.
I knew I was on a different page and they were on their page. So in that sense, it was okay. If that's what you believe, then you believe that. In my sense, it was okay. I'm beyond it now. And I see that I had to leave. And I eventually saw, I was first extremely angry.
I was going to ask, were you deeply wounded and hurt by this experience?
Terribly so.
Yeah.
And our kids were in the youth group. They were humiliated because their parents are being thrown out for being kooks. And so they were traumatized, which made it even worse for me and Danae, because when you see your kids hurt by something like that, you know, the anger that wells up. And I'm driving in my car every day to work, and I'm having 100 conversations to explain to this group of leaders why they're so off base. Until I finally processed to the point that I realized they had to do what they did if they had any integrity, and if they truly believed what they actually believed, they had to do what they did, and that is get rid of things that they believed were heresy. And on the other hand, I had to do what I had to do, and that was I had to be true to the things that I saw and believed about a God who was able to reconcile the planet and able to restore all things, and so on and so forth, as we've talked about in these other podcasts. And so I went my way at that point, but it dispersed my anger toward them, because I began, basically like Spiral Dynamics says, I began to realize what lens they were looking through, and they did what they felt like they had to do, and I did the same.
The micro macro I'm interested in. You walked out of that church wounded, hurt, rejected in a lot of ways.
Oh, yeah. Big time.
Leaving that behind, what a symbol, because there was also a macro level that you weren't just leaving behind that church and that denomination. You also were walking away from Christianity as a whole. Did you realize that in that moment, that I'm not just leaving this church, I'm actually leaving Christianity?
If I didn't, and I can't tell you everything in my head that very day, I was real close to it. And certainly because we never went back or sought out another church, the things that we had already been discussing about something beyond Jesus as a religion, that discussion that, look, Jesus has got to be bigger than a religion, that finally took root that day. And Danae and I decided that that is the place where we were going to exist.
Okay. How about let's just close there.
Okay. Cool.
And I want to say this though, because my spirit, whatever language you want to call it, my gut, internally something tells me this. There are probably a whole lot of listeners that resonate with your story. And I want to say this, would you, Doug, have anything to say to them of folks that feel like they've been kicked out of a local church? It just didn't work. They've been wounded. There's so much spiritual trauma. And they had a moment just like you that walked out of a church. If you could have told yourself anything in that moment, what would you say to any of our listeners that have experienced that or are in the process of experiencing that rejection?
For me, it was that I never ever questioned the story of God, and that I left believing that Jesus absolutely came to accomplish some things, and that I did not think that limiting or confining Jesus to a building or a religion was going to accomplish those things, and that my healing and my overcoming the woundedness and my going on with my wife and my children was all a result of not leaving that story, but rather reinterpreting that story, which I had been doing all along, and which our listeners have been doing all along if they've changed churches ever in their life. I stuck with the story of Jesus, but I reframed it.
That sounds so Christian.
And so my answer to that when people say, why are you post-Christian? I tell them it's because that's what Christ taught.
And that's, my friends, that's where we're headed. We'll start unpacking this as we get to this next podcast. People, Doug leaves Christianity, Post-Christian Part 2.
Thank you for joining us today. If you have any questions or comments, please contact us at info@presence.tv. You can also visit our website at presence.tv or find us on Facebook. We look forward to hearing from you.